समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
An episode of Cut the Clutter today that's rooted in the history of Cold War tells us the future of big power alliances and the future of geopolitics and also the current state of play. We are talking about Diego Garcia, remember? Now, I'm spoiled for choice in terms of what to begin this with. There are many choices, each one equally interesting, but let me go back to Cold War. Cold War and what matters, a juncture of Cold War history that matters for India. So for India, peak Cold War. When was the peak Cold War moment? Think about it. And then I will tell you the peak Cold War moment was, say, March of 1971. 25th March 1971 is when the Pakistan Army crackdown began in what was then East Pakistan. That is when, for India, it was evident that Americans had decided fully to support Pakistan, fully and entirely, as like allies, like hamara bacha hai. India had already leaned greatly towards the Soviet Union and was in the process of signing the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation. That is why I call it the peak Cold War moment for India, because that's when India made its own Cold War choice. India did not join a camp, but India got as close to the Soviet camp as possible or plausible without actually joining it. It was at that moment, March 71, that something else started. And that something else was the construction of the big US military base at Diego Garcia. Remember that? If you are about my age, you will remember big headlines in newspaper, Diego Garcia, the big threat, the Americans coming into Indian Ocean. And then India also joined. India, in fact, led that whole movement for almost 2 decades, calling for Indian Ocean as a zone of peace. That in Indian Ocean, there should not be any military bases. That was actually a code for saying there should not be no American bases in the Indian Ocean, because by that time the Soviets already had bases on the African coast deep down along the Indian Ocean. Diego Garcia construction started then. By 1973 the work was more or less complete, and in the course of time it was expanded to have 2 huge 3.7 kilometer runways which can take the heaviest bombers, B-52s and more, the heaviest bombers, the heaviest transport aircraft. This also became a base just about 32 square kilometers. That's all. The entire island is a base and nothing else. No one else lives there. All of this became a base and then also became a place where a lot of the other materials were stockpiled. These were ammunition, bombs, missiles, also fuel. So big US or US allies military campaigns anywhere in a large geography could be supported from here. And about 20 to 25 piers were also built so that US Navy ships and US Navy's allied ships could also be serviced there. So this Diego Garcia came up there. However, this was located on stolen property. That stolen property, Diego Garcia and around, is mostly being restored to its rightful owner now, that's Mauritius, or is being paid for by way of a predetermined rent. How has this happened? Mauritius always had sovereignty over a group of islands called Chagos Islands, Chagos. Chagos Islands in the Indian Ocean, deep in the Indian Ocean. I will tell you how deep and how far from every conceivable place that you can think of, but give me a moment before that. The history first. It was part of Mauritius. Mauritius was a British colony. Mauritius was a British colony in the process of decolonization after the Second World War. This process of decolonization reached its high point in 1959 when Harold Macmillan made his famous Winds of Change speech, where he said that Britain should give up all its colonies. Then work started on Mauritius, which was a colony. There was a conference at Lancaster in 1965 when it was decided finally that Mauritius should get freedom. However, as the British gave Mauritius freedom, they did one thing, and that tells you how big powers behave. How big powers behave today, because they look very far ahead. They look 50 years ahead, 100 years ahead, 200 years ahead. They look way beyond a human being's life, because nations have lives much longer than those of human beings or the leaders who lead them at any point of time. So 1965, before giving Mauritius freedom, what did the British do? They excised the 60 small islands where almost nobody was a native. These islands were called Chagos Islands. Of these islands, 60 islands, some of these are just atolls, and they are part of the larger Lakshadweep Chagosian ridge, underwater ridge, kind of underwater mountain, where some of these atolls have come up and these islands have come up. The British excised these, cut these away from Mauritius. So as they were going to give freedom to Mauritius, they were going to keep these islands. They were not going to give these islands. So even in 1965, the British and their allies, mostly the Americans, had come to the conclusion that Cold War was already on, that everybody will fight for possession of the seas and also bases to control large geographies. This place was located in a very critical place, so they were not going to let Mauritius have it, or they were not going to let anybody else have it. So the British cut away the Chagos Islands, the 60 Chagos Islands from Mauritius, and also signed a 50-year agreement with the Americans, a 50-year agreement with the Americans in 1966 to let them have control or let them have use of these territories for security reasons, for defense purposes. The British were paid something for that. Itna free mein nahi tha. What was that amount? They were paid the $14 million equivalent. That was a discount given to them in the co-development of nuclear missiles to be fired from Polaris submarines, co-development with America. So they got a $14 million discount. For that, they sold away for 50 years, or rented away for 50 years, rights to use these islands for defense purposes to the Americans. That 50-year period would have ended in 2016, when it was extended by another 20 years to 2036. So what has happened now? After that, in Mauritius, there were lots of protests. Mauritius went to the UN. UN General Assembly passed a resolution with a large majority on 23rd of June 2017, referring the Mauritius Chagos Island issue to International Court of Justice. In 2019, International Court of Justice said the British ownership of these islands is illegal. Britain said this is not binding on us, but this ICJ order came back to the UN General Assembly, which again voted to say that this order was legitimate and the British should vacate Chagos Islands. However, the British did not, and negotiations went on and on and on. Finally, these negotiations came to a conclusion, say very early October or towards the end of September last year, 2024, when an accord was arrived at between the government of Mauritius and the government of the UK. That is something that the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced on 3rd of October. He announced it. Joe Biden said this was a great deal and he was quite happy with it. However, it was held in abeyance for the American presidential election because the election process was already on. Now the big change is, and that's the reason we are talking about this now, that Donald Trump said this looks like a very good deal. 140 years is a long time, great time. We are very happy. So what's 140 years? Why is the deal so significant? What the British and the Mauritians have done is that the ownership or sovereignty over all the Chagosian Islands has now been transferred to Mauritius, which was also the order of the International Court of Justice. However, in the deal, the British said that, look, we have strong security interests, military interests in Diego Garcia. We can't leave Diego Garcia. So you might have sovereignty over it, but why don't you just rent it to us, right? I'm using the expression rent it to simplify this. But the deal now is that the British will pay 90 million pounds per year now for the next 99 years. And this 90 million pound fee will be indexed, which means as inflation, etc. go up, there must be a formula. This will also go up. And some of this will be now given lump sum, like a rounded off amount, like on some net present value basis. So Mauritius can carry out some development activities, build infrastructure, and also some money has been given to Mauritius to resettle the Chagosian people. How many people are these? When the Americans took over the islands, there were about 924 people, just that many. These were mostly people who came to work on coconut plantations and stuff like that. You know, the history of colonization also is the history of resource curse. So any place which had resources, it can be today oil, it can be today going ahead critical minerals. See what's happening in Congo, see what's happening in Mozambique, other parts of Africa. That's about critical minerals, right? There's a lot of tussle about oil that we know very well in the Middle East and elsewhere. The resource curse in the olden times, say 400 years ago, 500 years ago, what was the resources which brought in a curse on the people where these resources are located? Very often, these were agricultural or horticultural resources. If you've read Amitabh Ghosh's Nutmeg's Curse, you will know what even agriculture, horticulture, just natural wealth, right? A tree that bears fruit, bushes or vines that bear spices, all of them also invited colonialism. So these islands were developed first by the Dutch, then by the French. And what else did the French use these islands for? They made a leper colony. Those days there was no treatment for leprosy. People who got leprosy, unfortunately, they were shunned and they were put as far away from other human beings as possible. So the French also developed this into a leper colony. Then France and England, as they fought wars in their own area in Europe, as one side won or lost, their colonial possessions also changed hands. We saw that happening in Pondicherry through the 19th century. It was at the end of those Napoleonic wars, as a result of the Paris Treaty, that France handed over these islands to the British. Since then, they've been under British control, and the British gave them a name, particularly after 1965, when they cut them away from Mauritius. They gave Mauritius freedom. 1967, Mauritius had its election, and 12th March 1968, Mauritius formally became independent. Then the British gave these islands a name, that is BIOT. BIOT stands for British Indian Ocean Territories. Very often you might see an email or a URL that ends .io. As we say .com or .in or .org, for example, it says .io. That IO is short form for British Indian Ocean Territories. The settlement, therefore, now is that Mauritius gets these islands back. If Mauritius so wishes, it can resettle any of the Chagosians, which might be about 2,000 people right now, 3,000 maybe, on any of the other islands, but not on Diego Garcia, which will remain purely a military base. That is how this deal has been done. Now, how the Chagosians were expelled from these islands, particularly from Diego Garcia, is a very sad story, because when the Americans came in, from 1968, this expulsion started, because there were two reasons why Diego Garcia was chosen for this base. One is the geography. Sometimes, just as you have a resource curse, I told you resource curse can come from minerals, from oil, from critical minerals now, or it can come from your agriculture, horticulture. So many islands were colonized and populated in the past to grow sugarcane, to grow tea, to grow coffee. So many countries and so many regions to grow tobacco. Or to grow tobacco or nutmeg or coconut. Similarly, for some regions, some countries, geopolitical location also becomes a kind of a curse. And that's what happened with Diego Garcia and Chagos Islands as well. One of the reasons, therefore, this island was chosen for this big military base was its geopolitical location. I will explain to you what this location is. And second, because there were hardly any human beings there. Because if the Americans and their allies had taken another island on which maybe 50,000 human beings lived, then removing them or quarantining them or keeping them away from the base would have become a problem. In any case, that population would have risen, they would have had their own lives, there would have been security issues, would not have been possible to run an island purely as a military base. That's a big privilege that the Americans saw they will get in Diego Garcia. Now see the location of Diego Garcia. It's a part of Mauritius, but Mauritius is not the large landmass closest to Chagos Islands. So Diego Garcia, let's see the distance from Diego Garcia. If you want to see what is closest, maybe Maldives. Maldives is just 726 kilometers. If you want to see from the Indian southwestern coast, even from there, it's much closer than it is from Mauritius. It is to the east of Mauritius. See the map of that part of the world. It is to the east of Mauritius, 2,112 kilometers. From the southwest of India, if you go further southwest, that is 1,796 kilometers. So less distant from Indian southwestern coast than from Mauritian eastern coast. Then 726 kilometers generally south of Maldives, 3,535 kilometers east of Tanzania. That's from the African mainland, African coast. Once again, understand. And you can again see on the map how far from Somalia. It is in fact probably the island most distant from any other inhabited landmass than any in the world, among the many. That's why this is among the two big military bases that America has in the Indo-Pacific region. That's the reason it's one of the two major American military bases in the Indo-Pacific region. One is Diego Garcia, the other is Guam. Focus again on the map of the Indian Ocean region where Diego Garcia is, and you will see all around it for thousands of kilometers. All you see is sea, and then some islands appear. From Indonesia, that is from the Sumatran island, to the west-southwest of Sumatran Islands, it's 2,877 kilometers. From Australia, it is 4,723 northwest. Important thing is when you travel all these distances between you and Diego Garcia, there is nothing. Once again, this helps us understand the geopolitical value of this tiny island. Now, if you want to understand this better or do a deeper reading, I am also sharing some writings with you. You will have the links with the description. One is the International Institute of Strategic Studies, IISS strategic comments on this issue. Please see that. Second is a Lowy Institute paper. Lowy Institute is a reputed Australian institute. This is titled Strategic Consequences of Chagos Islands Dispute. And then there is a paper from Carnegie, which is beautiful. It is just about mapping the Indian Ocean. So please see that. You can also play with it. And as you play with it, you will see how far do big powers think. And the current agreement of the lease is 99 years, extendable by another 40 years. That's how forward the big powers think. And that's the reason Donald Trump was celebrating this as a 140-year deal.